Something genuinely historic is unfolding right now, and most of the commentary you're seeing in the mainstream press is completely missing the deeper architecture of what's actually happening. We are watching in real time what may be one of the most consequential diplomatic pivots of the 21st century. A sitting American president who launched a war against Iran just 4 weeks ago alongside Israel is now sending his envoys through the back channels of Islamabad to negotiate a way out. Pakistan, a Muslim-majority nuclear-armed state that doesn't host a single American military base, is suddenly the most important country on the map. And nobody in the comfortable seats of Washington commentary is asking the real question: what does this actually tell us about the current balance of power in the world? Pakistan's Prime Minister Shehbaz Sharif publicly announced that his country is willing to host talks between the US and Iran in pursuit of what he called a comprehensive settlement of the ongoing war, tagging Trump, US Special Envoy Steve Witkoff, and Iranian Foreign Minister Abbas Araghchi directly in the post. Now, on the surface, that sounds diplomatic, measured, civilized even. But sit with the details for a moment, because the details are where the real story lives. The Washington Post reported that Pakistan, Egypt, and Turkey have been acting as intermediaries in talks between Witkoff and Araghchi. Think about that for a second. The United States, the most powerful military force in the world, is passing notes through 3 other countries to speak to a nation it is actively bombing. That's not dominance. That is a country trying to find an exit with some dignity still attached to it. The war between the US and Israel against Iran began on February 28th, and since that first day, Iran's Islamic Revolutionary Guard Corps announced that the Strait of Hormuz was closed to shipping, the single most important waterway for global oil, through which roughly 1/5 of the world's crude flows. Oil prices surged above $100 a barrel compared with the pre-war Brent crude benchmark of around $65. Let that land. A 60% spike in oil prices in under a month. That's not a market fluctuation. That is a structural shock to the entire global economy. Every American family filling up their gas tank is now living the downstream consequences of a war they weren't asked about, weren't warned about, and largely weren't even told the full truth about. Thousands of people have been killed in the Middle East over nearly 4 weeks of conflict across Iran, Lebanon, Israel, and the Gulf states, as strikes by Iran, the US, and Israel have shown little sign of abating. And yet, even as the bombs keep falling, Trump's envoy Steve Witkoff confirmed in a cabinet meeting that the US had presented a 15-point action list forming the framework for a peace deal, which mediator Pakistan then delivered directly to Iran. 15 points, a formal written proposal delivered through Islamabad. That is not the behavior of a country that has won a war. That is the behavior of a country looking for a structured way to stop fighting. Now here is where I want you to slow down and think carefully, because this matters enormously for how you understand the world going forward. The change in the US posture came after warnings from Gulf allies that striking civilian power sites in Iran could lead to disastrous escalation. America's closest partners in the Gulf, the same partners the US relies on for basing rights, for oil production coordination, for regional influence, told Washington, do not do this. And Washington listened. That tells you something profound about who actually holds leverage in the Middle East today. It is not simply the country with the most aircraft carriers. It is the country that controls the geography, the energy flows, and the consent of the regional actors on the ground. The 15-point proposal offered sanctions relief to Iran in return for the removal of all its enriched uranium, abandonment of enrichment processing capabilities, limits on Tehran's ballistic missile program, and the cessation of support for militant groups including Hezbollah, the Houthis, and Hamas. Now put yourself in Tehran's position for a moment. You've been bombed for 4 weeks. More than 1,500 people have been killed in Iran alone, with over 18,000 injured, according to official Iranian health ministry figures. Your military commanders are being assassinated. Israel killed the head of the Iranian Revolutionary Guard's navy in an overnight strike. Your infrastructure is in ruins. And now the country that did all of this to you wants you to hand over your enriched uranium, gut your missile program, and publicly abandon every regional ally you've spent decades cultivating in exchange for sanctions relief. Sanctions relief they imposed on you in the first place. Iran's foreign minister Abbas Araghchi said the country wants to end the war only on its own terms, and Iran gave 5 conditions: an end to aggression, concrete guarantees preventing the recurrence of war, guaranteed payment of war damages and compensation, a comprehensive end to the war across all fronts, including against all resistance groups, and recognition of Iran's sovereignty over the Strait of Hormuz. Now, that last point, sovereignty over the Strait of Hormuz, is not a negotiating position. That is a fundamental assertion about the geography of power in the Persian Gulf. And it is the kind of demand that, if granted, would permanently restructure the energy calculus of the entire planet. Iranian state-affiliated media reported that parliament was planning to formalize fees for ships passing through the Strait of Hormuz. Think about what that means. Iran is proposing to turn the world's most critical oil choke point into a toll road that it controls. That's a revolution in the global economic order dressed up as a maritime policy. Pakistan's leverage in all of this lies in a very rare combination. It is the only Muslim-majority country with nuclear weapons and does not host US military bases. It maintains long-standing ties with Saudi Arabia dating back to 1947, reinforced by a strategic defense pact signed in September 2025, and it shares a 900-kilometer border with Iran while hosting the world's second-largest Shia Muslim population. No other country on earth has that specific combination of relationships. Not Turkey, not Egypt, not Qatar. Pakistan sits at the intersection of multiple power axes simultaneously, and that intersection is precisely why Islamabad is now the room where the future is being written. Steve Witkoff, Trump's envoy, has a direct working relationship with Pakistan's Army Chief Field Marshal Asim Munir, and Trump himself has publicly called Munir a great general and a great guy. Field Marshal Munir spoke directly with Trump on March 23rd, asking not to be identified because the discussions are private, and Pakistan is positioning Islamabad as the location for the talks. So what you actually have here is a Pakistani military general serving as the human bridge between the President of the United States and the government of Iran. Not a diplomat in the traditional sense, a military man, a field marshal. That is an extraordinary thing, and it tells you that the real negotiations are not happening through the State Department, not through the UN Security Council, not through any of the formal multilateral institutions that were supposedly designed for exactly this kind of crisis. They are happening through personal relationships between strongmen, which tells you something deeply important about the actual architecture of power in 2026. Pakistan's mediation efforts in the Iran-US crisis received strong endorsements from both Kuwait and China, highlighting Islamabad's emerging role as a key diplomatic player in the region. China's Foreign Minister Wang Yi underscored that initiating peace talks in the ongoing conflict is no easy task, but stressed that such efforts are essential. China endorsing Pakistan's role. Let that breathe for a moment. Beijing, which has its own strategic interests in Iranian oil, in Gulf stability, in the Belt and Road infrastructure that runs through Pakistan, is now publicly throwing its weight behind Islamabad as the peace broker. This is not an accident. This is a coordinated geopolitical signal. What China is saying without saying it out loud is this: the architecture of the post-American world is being built right now, and Pakistan is one of the keystones. The announcement of the talks, made 2 hours before the open of US trading on Monday, resulted in a rally on Wall Street and a sharp slide in the price of Brent crude, both of which had been causing significant concern for Trump and his advisors. Now here is something I find absolutely fascinating, and I don't think enough people are pausing on it. The President of the United States announced potential peace talks, timed deliberately to the opening of financial markets. 2 hours before Wall Street opened, oil went down, stocks went up, and Trump's approval numbers, which have been hammered by the economic fallout of his own war, got a little bit of breathing room. In other words, the peace push is not entirely about peace. It is also, perhaps primarily, about managing the domestic economic and political consequences of a war that is starting to hurt ordinary Americans very visibly at the gas pump and in their retirement accounts. Trump declared on Tuesday that the war in Iran had already been won and that regime change had been achieved, as more than 3 weeks of airstrikes killed many of Iran's senior leaders and destroyed much of its military capability. "We've won this. This war has been won," Trump said. But here's the thing, Iran is still fighting. Iran fired 2 rounds of missiles at central Israel, causing destruction and injuries, and Gulf nations are facing a wave of Iranian missile and drone attacks as Tehran retaliates against ongoing US and Israeli strikes. You don't fire missiles in 2 directions simultaneously if you've been defeated. Iran's government is damaged, its military has taken enormous losses, its nuclear facilities have been struck, and yet the country is still generating enough organized military resistance to strike Israel, the Gulf, and US assets simultaneously. A country that has lost does not do that. What you're watching is not the collapse of Iran. What you're watching is the exhaustion of the US-Israeli military campaign against a country that has spent 40 years preparing specifically to survive exactly this kind of assault. Since 1992, Iran's interest section in Washington, which handles limited diplomatic matters after the two countries severed relations in 1980, has operated under the protection of the Pakistani embassy. That single sentence carries 46 years of quiet history inside it. Pakistan has been the silent thread connecting Washington and Tehran for over 3 decades, operating behind institutional walls while everyone else was performing outrage. This is not new. This is simply the moment when that quiet thread became visible to everyone. The head of the International Energy Agency warned that the disruption to energy markets already exceeds the combined oil crises of 1973 and 1979. I want you to understand what that means in historical terms. 1973, 1979. Those two oil shocks reshaped the entire Western economic order. They produced stagflation, unemployment, political upheaval, and a fundamental restructuring of how America related to Middle Eastern energy. The IEA is telling us right now, in plain language, that what we are experiencing today is worse than both of those crises combined. And yet the major American television networks are spending more airtime on the latest celebrity controversy than on a statement of that magnitude from the world's foremost energy watchdog. That gap between the severity of the reality and the shallowness of the public discourse is itself one of the most important stories of this moment. Pakistan Foreign Minister Ishaq Dar told Parliament on March 3rd that Pakistan was ready to facilitate dialogue between Washington and Tehran in Islamabad, and in the same address, Dar revealed that Pakistan had pushed back against Washington's demand for zero uranium enrichment, instead proposing a monitored framework where 2 to 3 countries could conduct surveillance, and that Iran was open to this idea. This is the detail that almost nobody picked up on. Pakistan, the intermediary, was not simply passing messages. Pakistan was actively editing the terms of engagement, proposing a framework that was more moderate than Washington's original position, and doing so in a way that kept both sides at the table. That is not the behavior of a postal service. That is the behavior of a co-architect of the agreement. And if a deal is eventually reached, it will have Pakistan's fingerprints on the actual substance of its terms, not just on the venue. Iran's response to the 15-point proposal included a counter-demand for war reparations, meaning Iran is asking the United States to pay for the destruction it caused. This is not a detail that should slide past you. War reparations from the United States to Iran. The optics of that demand alone are enough to make the entire negotiation politically impossible in Washington. Can you imagine any version of the US Congress approving payments to Tehran? And yet, Iran put it on the table, which tells you that Iran's leadership is either preparing its population for a long fight, or it is using the reparations demand as a bargaining chip to trade away in exchange for something more structurally important, like formal recognition of its role in governing the Strait of Hormuz. The White House refused to elaborate on the discussions, with Press Secretary Caroline Leavitt saying the U.S. will not negotiate through the press and that the situation is fluid and speculation about meetings should not be deemed final until formally announced by the White House. That is the language of a government that is actively managing the domestic narrative around a war it launched, a war that has become more complicated than it anticipated, against an adversary that proved more resilient than the pre-war intelligence apparently suggested. Read between the lines of every official statement, and you will find a story of an administration recalibrating in real time. NPR's Daniel Estrin in Tel Aviv reported that 2 Israeli military officials said Israel wants to keep fighting and is hoping for several more weeks of war in Iran, and that the Israeli military was speeding up its targeting in Iran over the next 48 hours, focusing on hitting Iran's arms factories as much as possible in case a ceasefire is declared. And there it is, the tension at the heart of this entire moment. The United States and Israel went into this war together, but they do not share the same exit strategy. Israel wants more time. Israel wants to maximize the degradation of Iranian military capacity before any ceasefire locks in the current situation. The United States, feeling the economic pressure of a $100 oil barrel, watching its stock market whipsaw with every diplomatic statement, managing a domestic political environment that is growing increasingly uncomfortable, is looking for a way out. The interests are diverging. And the divergence of interest between Washington and Tel Aviv, when it becomes public and permanent, would be one of the most significant geopolitical shifts in decades. Saudi Crown Prince Mohammed bin Salman, over the last week, pushed Trump to continue fighting Iran, according to the New York Times, citing people briefed by US officials on their conversations. even as foreign ministers of Pakistan, Egypt, Turkey, and Saudi Arabia had gathered in Riyadh to discuss finding a diplomatic end to the war. So you have Saudi Arabia's diplomats in the same room discussing peace, while the Crown Prince is privately telling Trump to keep bombing. That is the Middle East in a single paragraph. Every actor is playing multiple games simultaneously, maintaining relationships on all sides, because nobody, not Riyadh, not Islamabad, not Ankara, not Cairo, wants to be caught on the losing side of what comes next. What comes next is the question that actually matters, because even if a ceasefire is reached, even if US and Iranian envoys sit across a table in Islamabad and sign a piece of paper, the deeper questions this war has exposed will not go away. Can the United States project military power against a mid-sized regional power and achieve its political objectives? The answer this war is providing is not as cleanly as previously assumed. Can the global energy system absorb a prolonged closure of the Strait of Hormuz? The answer the markets are screaming back is absolutely not. And can the informal diplomatic structures of the old unipolar world, where Washington made decisions and everyone else accommodated them, still hold? The answer that Pakistan's emergence as the indispensable mediator is providing is, those structures are already dissolving, new ones are forming, and they look very different from what we were told the world would become. This is not simply a story about Trump or about Iran or about Pakistan. This is a story about the actual lived reality of a global power transition happening right now in real time, messier and more dangerous and more consequential than any textbook predicted. The peace talks in Islamabad, if they happen, will be a milestone in that transition, not because they will solve everything, but because they will confirm formally and visibly that the world has more than one center of gravity now. And that is the most important thing to understand about this moment.